Warren has been a military and historical model for over 30 years. He builds dioramas, armor, and figures in multiple scales. He transitioned to narrow gauge after finding and reading the PBL dispatch and was hooked evermore. He dabbled in ON30 and HON3 until he finally came over to the dark side to SN3. He was introduced to SN2 by a great model and mentor, Jerry Wilson. And he finally settled to model SN3 and SN2 with the help of a good friend and mentor, a fellow SN3 modeler, John McKenzie. With that brief introduction, welcome to the show, Warren. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Pete, for letting me do this presentation. It's been something that I've been wanting to do for a while. But I'd like to thank everybody first for letting me even do it, the NNG group. Thank the people's shoulders that I've stood on. Thank the Lord for giving me the ability to actually have the hobby and to the talents He's given me. With this approach, I'd like to show a different technique that a lot of people use or don't use, I should say, and maybe help a lot of people from a perspective of seeing static grass from a different view and from more of a less of a commercial method and more from a military modeler's and artist perspective. It's going to change there. So the supplies needed here is pretty simple. Just the paint we'll use. I've used two different techniques: the airbrush, the spray can. You need a paint palette, flat brushes for dry brushing, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. Old brushes, which I use to apply the glue mixture. Airbrush if you're using that in the compressor. White glue, I prefer wood glue. It just seems to be a little bit better. And then a white glue water mixture, which is 30 to 70, which is what we'll use to actually mix the uh, basic white glue, and it actually helps flow the white glue across the surface that we're going to use, and it actually helps with the application of the static grass. Static grass can be any size, 6 millimeter all the way to 12. It's your choice. A shot vac or a handheld vac, and then obviously the static grass applicator is not needed, especially after we learn this technique. So here we have the Titebond, the glue mixture. These are the supplies that I had. You can see the static grass applicator on the right. And we'll get into a little bit about that a little bit later, but these are just the supplies I'm using. I'm using the 6 and the 10, the 12 millimeter static grass. Next slide. Here's our palette per se. This is what we're going to use just to demonstrate this. This is just an SN3 track that I've used some Sculptamold, which is the preferred modeling compound that I use for all my groundwork. And it's just what we're going to use to apply the static grass. Next slide. Here's just a close of it. You can see the groundwork along near the tracks there. Next. Titebond, love the glue. I use it for all my modeling, especially with wood. It's a great glue. White glue can work with this just a little bit better. So as we're going to do is we're just going to apply the white glue right out of the bottle, right onto the surface that you're going to do. And you're just going to continue to move it across. Next slide. Into the area that we're going to put the static grass. We just land it out there like that. Here's the glue mixture. The glue mixture is 30-70. And what we do with the glue mixture, which is really important, is we're going to add the glue mixture to the actual glue that's already on there. And that's just going to dilute it enough so it can be spread around. Next slide. Here we're just applying it right to the top of the surface of the glue we already applied, and we're just going to slide it all the way across to the left here, as you can see. And I just moved it back and forth. Here I'm using a brush. The brush is just going to push it out a little better into the areas that you want to apply your static grass. It's just a lot easier there. And I just used an old beat up brush. Here it is, but it's already done. This is the area that we're going to apply the static grass with. I'm using 10 and 12 millimeter static grass, which is very difficult to use with the static grass applicator. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but you can see that here once we get to the next slide. All right, really quickly. Which one is better, the static grass applicator or using a vacuum? Which method can do more of a surface area? Can manual application give the same results as the applicator? Can a vacuum make grass stand? Judge the results. We'll be able to see that here in a little bit. Next slide. I just use a pinching method. Just grab a small amount of static grass, and we're just going to apply it to the surface. And I just do a twisting motion just to get the static grass out of my fingers, allowing it to fall gently onto the field. And here it is applied all the way across. Next slide. I'm just using just a vacuum cleaner. You can use a shot vac. It doesn't matter which vacuum you can use, but it's just the point is we're going to suck up the static grass and we're going to manipulate it. Next slide. I usually go to about 1 to 2 inches from the static grass. And what that does, it pulls up all the static grass that's not being used and allows the static grass to actually stand up as we're moving it across the surface. Next slide. You can manipulate the static grass left, right, forward, backwards by using this. You got about a 10 to 12, maybe 15-second time period before the static grass actually just stands eventually where you decided to put it from pulling it from left to right. Next slide. Just shows you the different methods where you can pull it. Next slide. Same thing here. We're just pulling the static grass. Here's the results of the static grass. You can actually see how well it stands up, and it pulls up all the excess static grass that you're not using. Next slide. Here's a very close up of it so you can really see how well it stands up. Now we're going to do 6mm grass. The same process is going to be applied as we're doing it as we did with the 12mm. And you can see that in the next slide. Same process, white glue mixture, using the 30-60 mixture, manipulate it across the groundwork, and then pulling it back and forth to fill in whatever crevice. And there it is when it's finally done. So now we're going to apply the static grass, same method, just a pinching method, grabbing it, and I'm just pulling it back and forth, twisting it as I put over the top of the surface of the white glue. Here it is, vacuuming it up the same way. You're pulling up all the excess and you're allowing the static grass to be manipulated and pulled up through the vacuum. There is a close-up of it. I think I have another one. There's another close-up. That's 6mm next to the 12. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix the two. So a lot of times when I use static grass at 12mm, what will happen is you'll have bald spots or areas that it doesn't fill in very well. That's what the 6mm is for. So we're going to apply the 10 and 12 the exact same way we just did. Next slide. That pinching method, squeezing it, pulling it off. And then we apply the 6mm to spots where the 12mm didn't fill in. It's a really good way to have multiple static grass surfaces. There it is without the vacuum. And here I am pulling it up. There's a close-up of it being done, I think. And there it is, a really super close-up, the mixture of both the 6 and the 12mm. There's a really close-up picture of it, so you can really see how well it stands up. Static grass applicator or contoured surface as well. One of the things is people are worried about it, like on hills or rock formations. It does the same thing. The results are the same regardless of your groundwork. The application is also the same throughout. So here's some of the areas that I've actually built up in the back intentionally where we're going to put the static grass. Here's the static grass after it's been applied using the same method as we described earlier, and you're getting the same results. Painting static grass or not, this is probably the most important things about the static grass for me. Unpainted static grass, to me, this is my personal opinion, and from a military modeling perspective, is 99% of us paint our static grass. The static grass you get on the market, to me, doesn't look real, and you'll see once we get into this, the next slides. The purpose of actually painting it is to give it a more realistic approach. And we can use both an airbrush, a rattle can, or hand painted, or all three. Here I'm just using some Rust-Oleum right out of a rattle can. It's a very flat color, it's a dark brown. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build up 3 to 4 layers of colors so you really get that depth. You can use an airbrush. I have the airbrush colors in the back. It's just black tire, dark green, and then a military green. Painted, put some blue tape over the tracks just so we don't overspray onto the rail. I'm using earth brown. This is one of the colors we're going to use. We're going to spray it right out of the can. We spray probably around 3 to 6 inches away. You don't want to get too much paint, and you don't want to have too little paint. Again, just spray the paint right over the top of the static grass, moving it from left to right until you get that color you want. The rubber tires is what I'm using for the airbrush. Same process, 3 to 6 inches all the way across. And here's a really good example. Though it's dark, you can see the difference between the non-painted static grass versus the painted static grass. And we'll have that comparison throughout these photos. Here's a close-up of it, that dark brown color. And here's a close-up of it unpainted. Next slide. Now I'm going to use a deep forest green out of a rattle can. Again, it's from that military color that you can use. And here is the dark green over that. Again, the contrast between the two. Here I'm using dark green for the airbrush, which is Vallejo, and you're going to use it through the airbrush. applying it to the same method. Last, we're going to use the Army Green out of the rattle cans, which gives it a more of a brighter green color. And then I'm going to use Uniform Green. And what color green is your choice? You can choose whatever color you want. Here, I'm going to actually do some dry brushing now on the top of it. It's one of the other techniques that I use. If you're familiar with dry brushing, basically you're wetting your brush and you're wiping it off till just a little bit of the paint's on, and you're just going to go over the top of the raised surfaces. And you can see here as I start to go over it, just over the top lightly, and just color those tops of the areas of the static grass. And there's a close-up of it. So here's the static grass as I've already painted it with the dark green, and then the static grass below, which is unpainted, so you kind of get a feel for that color. This is a really good color. I want to touch on everybody. Everybody's talking about Depot buff, and that this color right here, this Babel green, is the closest I've ever seen in a rattle can ever. And it's next slide. It comes from a company called Mountain. This is number 94. It's a phenomenal color to paint. If you run out of Depot buff and you need a quick fix, this is an excellent paint to use for Depot buff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the top, and we're going to give that lighter greenish yellow color over the top of the grass. It's really going to pop the grass. And here you can see the static grass now with that color on it. And here's a close-up of it. A lot more realistic. And there's the difference between the static grass in the back and the static grass in the front, unpainted versus painted. Here's just a closer view of it so you can really see the difference. So what you can do with this green color is it's also being used for the airbrush. The neat thing about this color is that it's able to fill in the gaps, especially if you've overcolored it with the yellow. So you can bring back that green color again. So you can transition back and forth if your color is either too bright or too dark. You can go with using an airbrush, spraying it over the surfaces. And then the antique gold, if you want to dry brush it, it's one of my favorite colors, Deco Art. You can do the same thing again. You can dry brush over the top of it. If your color is a little bit too dark or it's a little bit too light, you can just bring that color out again. And here I am just dry brushing the tops of this area, highlighting the colors. And you can do it to what your eye sees and looks best. There's the view of it from the back and then from the front. You can see the two difference. As you can see, I'm starting to color the bottom already, and I'm doing the top again. There's the contrast again. So what I'm doing here now with the Deco Art, this black is my favorite black. I use it on everything that I paint, whether it's from engines to figures to buildings to groundwork. It's just the best paint that I've ever used. But the reason I'm using this is I'm going to fill in the gaps of where the grass meets the dirt. And I'm using that to give that really sharp contrast of dark versus the highlights of the grass. So you get that dark area into the groundwork. You'll see in the next slide. I'm just filling it in all along the tracks. And this dries extremely flat once it's dry. So you get that ditch look when you're doing it. Here, I'm just going to ballast the stand. Or I'm just going to ballast it with the stand. I love this sand color and this for using for ballast. I think it's an excellent color. You can get it at, I think, one of the hobby stores, but it's an excellent product to use for ballast. Here it is, ballast on the tracks, and there's a close-up of it. The final results in different settings. This is really important. As a military model, you'll see some of the things that I do in the hobby, from sculpting models or sculpting figures and painting figures and things like that. But you can see the different results of what the grass looks like when it's finally done. And so I wanted to give you a different perspective. Here's one of the cars next to the static grass after it's finished. It's the short 6-inch right there. Next one. Here's one of the logging cars with the 12-inch. You can see the color difference. There they are together. Next slide. Here's a close-up of my water tank on my SN2 layout. And I'm going to do 3 shots where you can see really close to the static grass so you can really get an idea of how nice it looks. Next slide. And there's a super close-up what the static grass looks next to the water tank. Here it is on the layout next to a tree, pine tree that I have. Next slide. This is just a slide that I had that's on the layout. Just shows you the grass and how you can apply it on the side of a hill. Here it is with some of the SN2 coal cars along the edges. Here it is behind one of the engine houses I have with the trees on the side of the hill. There's another view. Here it is on two figures that I did of my grandsons. You can really see how it affects the groundwork with them playing soccer. Here's the military figure that I did of World War II tech sergeant, 2nd Infantry Division. You can see the grass there. I have actually a really good close-up of the grass when you see it. And you can see the highlights of the yellow and how it works its way dark to the ground, giving it that really large depth effect. Here's a figure from a personal friend of mine, just shows you what he did with the static grass. Close up of it from the back. And here's one from another friend of mine. You can see he's got a more of a lighter color, more of a summer color. There's a close up of it. And you can see the difference between non-painted static grass and static grass. To me, it just seems to pop more and it just looks more realistic. Here's one of the shays next to the 6-inch, and over to the left there is the actual 12-inch, one of my shays. Here's a super close up of it right next to it, so you can really see the color variations from lower to up to the top to the dark greens and the highlights and the yellows. Here's another view of it. This is from the piece that we just did. And the final piece here, the last slide there, is just a picture of the layout showing you on the side of the hill that I did. You can really get great depth and great color from painting it. It's just a matter of what colors you want to use. You can do fall, summer, winter. And like I said before, to me, static grass out of the bottle just doesn't look right to me. And that's probably from all the years that I've had as a military modeler, and we all paint our static grass and dry brush it or highlight it with an airbrush. But to me, it looks a lot more realistic. Thank you for allowing me to present it.
Hey, thank you, Warren. That was a wonderful presentation. Let me see what we have for questions in the chat room. Um, Dave says, is the Titebond glue actually white or is it yellow, carpenter glue? For the 3070 blue mix, what is the percentage of the glue?
Oh, yeah. Oh, first of all, the first question, it's yellow. The glue mixture is 70 glue, 30% water.
Okay. Robin Peel says, how do you choose between the static applicator or the vacuum method? Is there a difference in the results?
Absolutely. The biggest results that I'll give you three reasons why I use the vacuum method. Number one, the biggest one is that I can do a larger space in a shorter amount of time. I can do a 2-foot section in probably 20 minutes.
Mhm.
With the static grass applicator, you're limited to how much you can do in the amount of time you're given. And more importantly, it's very difficult to use the static grass applicator using 10 and 12-inch or 12 millimeter static grass. You have to use, I think it's 8 and below. And for those of us who maybe work in O scale, and you want that taller grass, you want to be able to use something to actually make it stand up better. The
Okay,
applicator doesn't do that.
gotcha. Keith Stapper, to everyone, do you reuse static grass that has been captured in the vacuum cleaner?
It's funny you mentioned that. It's one of the things that I thought about doing. I mean, there's not much. There's not much. Yeah, I
O-
mean, yeah, I don't
Okay.
actually.
Okay, Robin, again, we learned so much from the military modelers. Boy, that's the truth. They do such good work. Barry Dupler, can you post a list of the paints you use? Great technique.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I can post it.
Okay. Gerald Harper, why don't you like static guns, Gerald? I guess you pretty well explained that, but go ahead.
Oh, again, I mean, one of the things about the static applicator is that you're limited to the size of it. It's usually like a 3-inch, maybe 4-inch opening. Um, and you're only allowed to do small sections of it. I mean, some of my buddies that are military modelers will do it on a small diorama or a small figure base, but to do it on a large section in a with a short amount of time, I think the application is way better using it the way I do it. And I'm not saying there may be a better way out there, but I've been able to do my whole buddy's layout in 2 days, and he's got a 20 by 25-foot layout. I spent a lot of time there. I spent 8, 10, 12 hours there at a time, but I'm able to do large sections
Okay.
quickly.
Um, Robin Peel says, do you layer different lengths of static grass?
Yeah, well, we did that in the video. We use a 6 millimeter and a 10, and I usually start with the larger grass first, and then fill in the spots with the static grass in areas where the 10 and 12 or whatever larger size it may not fill or look as nice.
Hmm.
So you're getting that different heights. Is that
Yeah,
what he meant?
I believe so. You're using different on top of one another. Yes.
Yeah.
Alan says, did the military modelers have static grass before the model railroads, or did it become available to everyone at the same time?
That's
I guess
well, the
who was the first to use it?
military modelers. It's been around. It used to be called Knox, and before that, it was called Boyd's. It came out probably back in the late 70s, early 80s. I've been using it, for over probably 30, 35 years. And guys were using it before me. To me, when I had the opportunity to use static grass on the model railroad, it just looks to me so much more realistic, which is why a lot of people, 90% of the people, probably going towards it as opposed to using foam. Or back in the old days, I think the people used sawdust, didn't they?
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Warren. That was excellent as usual. We really appreciate your time and your
No worries.
talent. Thank you very
Thank you, sir.
much.